Okay, so today we're celebrating the online launch of My Year of Living Mindfully, a documentary that is more relevant, I think, than the filmmakers could have ever imagined, given the unprecedented challenges that the world is facing during the COVID pandemic. So this stimulating film illuminates both the promise and also the potential pitfalls of mindfulness practice as a gateway to mental and potentially also physical health. So I'm excited to introduce three panelists. But just to give my perspective, so my name is Dr. Lydia Brown. I'm a clinical psychologist, so I use mindfulness-based practices, on a weekly basis with my clients. So I'm interested to know about the possible, the science, the evidence, the practice of mindfulness, and how it might apply to my clients. And I'm also involved with some research into the science of both self-compassion and mindfulness as well. Okay, so now to introduce the panelists. First, of course, we have Shannon Harvey. So Shannon is the award-winning director of two internationally acclaimed documentaries, The Connection, Mind Your Body, and My Year of Living Mindfully, and this is what we'll be discussing today. So her book, The Whole Health Life, is about finding good health after being diagnosed with an autoimmune disease. As a journalist and filmmaker, she's spent many years working for leading news organisations such as the ABC in Fairfax. She's the recipient of the National Press Club of Australia's Health Journalist of the Year Award, and now produces a popular blog whilst balancing her health and being the mother of two adventurous boys. So we also have mindfulness meditation teacher Patrick Carney. Patrick has been practicing mindfulness meditation since the late 1970s and has been teaching full-time for 20 years. He has trained chiefly in the lineage of Mahasi Sayadaw from Burma, a central reviver of mindfulness meditation in the modern world, and one of the sources for the approach taught by John Kabat-Zinn. So Patrick teaches intensive residential and virtual mindfulness retreats in Australia and around the world, as well as workshops and study courses. He has a particular interest in the original teachings of the Buddha, that as they were before the invention of Buddhism. He brings to our contemporary world the Buddha's understanding of mindfulness and how it leads to a flourishing human life. And finally, we have leading mindfulness researcher, Dr. Nicholas Van Dam. Nicholas is a senior lecturer in clinical psychology and deputy director of the Brain and Mental Health Hub at the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences at the University of Melbourne. He has published over 50 academic articles on topics related to mindfulness and meditation, anxiety and depression, decision-making, and function of the brain. He is internationally recognised for his research on mindfulness and meditation, and his article, Mind the Height, published in 2018, is one of the most read and cited academic articles in the field. In addition, Nicholas is the associate editor of the journal Mindfulness and won the Distinguished Doctoral Dissertation Award in 2014 from the State University of New York for his thesis on mindfulness for anxiety and depression. Okay, so to move into the panel, Shannon, firstly, congratulations on your fascinating film and for your timing. Our world has been turned upside down in many ways this year due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and many people around the world are looking for ways to cope. So I'm wondering, based on what you've learnt through making the film and speaking with experts from around the world in mindfulness, what are your thoughts about the role of mindfulness, if any, for supporting people at the moment during this really difficult time?
Yeah, when I set out to make My Year of Living Mindfully, the world was already tracking in all the wrong directions as far as the mental health statistics went. You've probably heard at the beginning of the film people like Nicholas talking about the current statistics, and what's really interesting is that here in Australia, for example, there's just been a massive announcement of more than $40 million is going to be put up to help people's mental health as a result of this COVID-19 pandemic. But there are so many questions for me about that. And it really comes down to one fundamental issue, which is that we still do not have an evidence-informed recommendation for what we can all be doing on a daily basis for ourselves to protect and nurture and nourish our minds. And it was Willem Kuyken, actually, from the Oxford Mindfulness Centre, who pointed out to me that right now we're waiting until people have the equivalent of stage 4 cancer before we actually do anything about their mental health. And this idea of preventive mental health is really just not even considered something that people should be investing time and energy into. That's not to say that we actually have all the answers, or even that mindfulness is necessarily the only solution, but it was certainly where I went with this film, because it was pretty much the only thing that I could find that ticked all my boxes.
Great, thank you. And I'm wondering, Nicholas, as an academic, you research mindfulness. What are your thoughts about this?
So, I mean, it's a particularly difficult time, and I think Shannon's film, and I think certainly her comments today, have reflected the need for preventative mental health and something along those lines, and that I think we need to do more work to identify people before they develop full-blown mental illness. It's a tricky enterprise. I mean, trying to identify which individuals are ultimately going to develop mental illness is something that we've been trying to do in psychiatry, psychology, and mental health for quite some time, and not very successfully. There hasn't been much focus, though, on sort of what to give people broadly that might actually aid in that process. And I think that's exactly what Shannon is saying, and what she talked about in the film. And I do think certainly mindfulness and meditation practices do hold some of that potential. They certainly tick a lot of the boxes in terms of, and this is identified in the film, the things that you can do fairly simplistically. You can certainly do it on your own. It doesn't require necessarily expensive access to gadget equipments or, instructors and things of that nature. However, the reality is, I think, and it's just important to recognize that we don't know the extent to which it works. We don't know which individuals it's most likely to help. We don't know things like how much and how long should people practice for. We don't really even know sort of who is best situated to teach this or train people to do this, nor do we even know really whether apps as they're marketed or websites as they're marketed can provide guidance in the way that will be both effective in terms of leading to positive outcomes, nor will they be authentic and helpful, in terms of, being consistent with sort of traditional practices, which I'm sure Patrick has a lot more to say. At the end of the day, I think, they do hold considerable promise, but we do, I think, really need to be careful not to jump to kind of making this the Band-Aid to the problem. And I think in the current situation that we find ourselves in the COVID pandemic in particular, we're seeing, and particularly with the Australian government, but we're also seeing this around the world, a lot of companies and organizations and governments are being quick to kind of hand out possible fixes and solutions. And I do think we need to be really cautious in how quickly we scale up and offer those interventions, because it's very possible that a number of people worldwide need a lot more than a mindfulness or meditation app in order to address the situation in which they find themselves. That's not to say that it might not be helpful. And I think that was addressed well in the film, that, there's a lot going on for a lot of people. And so I think it's important to acknowledge, and the film certainly does, that this is probably one part of a much bigger solution. But we need that additional work, I think, and that's really important to emphasize.
Great, thank you. And Patrick, both Shannon and Nicholas have spoken about this idea that, on the one hand, mindfulness is quite a simple topic. It's quite a simple idea, and yet around the world it's been applied in such a diversity of ways. There are apps, there are teachers, there are different types of teachers with different levels of experience. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the dissemination of mindfulness at the moment, and is it okay for people to just focus on apps, or what, how can we best sort of disseminate mindfulness?
Well, mindfulness practice is a skill that needs to be learned, and very few people can learn it without some kind of effective teaching. And there's multiple ways of conveying the teaching, so apps are one way. But I doubt whether the great majority of people would get very far listening to an app. It's good to get you started. But at some point, if you're serious about it, if you really want any kind of depth, you really do need a teacher of some sort. And then you get the kinds of problems that Nicholas was talking about, the scalability of this. Are there really enough teachers to go around? What's the standard for teachers? What would make an approved teacher of mindfulness? Is there any way of figuring that out? It's when you get to the scalability, the overall mental health situation, there are immense problems. Mindfulness practice itself is extremely good. It's very effective. It's not effective for everyone. For some people, it doesn't necessarily work. From my perspective as a meditation teacher, I know that there are plenty of people who basically should not attempt a meditation retreat. There are people who embark on meditation and it turns their life around. There are other people who embark on meditation and they get fed up with it and they walk away because it doesn't work for them. So there's no system that, as far as I could see, that you could say, okay, you could create this system, plant it into society and have X mental health outcomes. I really don't see how that is even conceivable.
Right. I think that's fascinating that you speak of these individual differences and how mindfulness might even be harmful for some people. It's not sort of a panacea for everybody to solve every problem. So I'm wondering, perhaps, Nicholas, how do we, from a research perspective, how can we determine when mindfulness might be helpful for somebody versus when it might be harmful or not beneficial?
Yeah, I think the first thing we need to do is to acknowledge the potential harm, or at least the sort of lack of potential benefits in certain individuals. And we've obviously done that here today, and I don't mean us. I think what I'm trying to say is sort of as a community, we need to think very carefully when we're offering mindfulness apps, when we're offering mindfulness programs, when we're offering mindfulness books, when the mindfulness industry, so to speak, is promoting the idea that they need to also include the caveat that it may not be the fix for everyone, and it's probably for a lot of people, even if it is going to be a fix, it's probably going to be a lot harder than they anticipate it will be. So certainly, if it is the fix, it's not a quick fix for most people. So I think that's really important that we acknowledge that. And I've reviewed a number of papers in the past 2 years where I see certain individuals trying to kind of sweep our paper, the Mind and Hype paper, under the rug and trying to say, no, it's all fine. This is just exaggerated. What they're saying is not really that big of a deal. And so I think to understand the extent and nature of the harms, the first key thing is really just to sort of explore who's experiencing them. There's been very few studies that have been looked at. What is the nature of these effects? What happens to people in meditation? I'm sure Patrick probably has a lot to say and probably has lots of knowledge. I don't know if he has time to share it all with us, but most meditation teachers with whom I've interacted have often told me all these stories of sort of occurrences of individuals. They have a long, complex history of working with individuals who have experienced troubles during meditation. And that's not to say, it's everybody or it's even most people, but it's not necessarily uncommon either. So I think that's really important that we start to explore, for who might this not be helpful. And then I think we really critically need to start thinking about some of these questions that, I've already hinted at and Patrick just talked about, what are the delivery mechanisms? Depending on the goals that certain individuals have, what ought they be doing? So, should they be using an app if their goal is just to get started? How quickly should they start reaching out for a teacher? Where do they find that teacher? How do the different outcomes that people want or the goals that people have, how do those relate to the type, amount, and duration of practice that we ought to recommend that they do? And I think that's really, as Shannon hinted, that we don't we don't really have guidelines, and I think we need those. We need some kind of clear guidelines where we could say to people, look, we'll never really know in total, but we could create some guidelines, I think, where we could say, look, these are the people for whom we really think that the idea of engaging with intensive meditation is a bad idea. These are the people for whom doing a particular type of meditation practice via an app is maybe an okay or a good idea. And these are the people for whom the only way that we would recommend you go forward is with a very skilled, very flexible and knowledgeable teacher in a kind of, one-on-one session, approach where you have direct guidance from that teacher. So I think those are really important things that we need to start thinking about as we address some of these issues, and we start to think about promoting this more broadly, or even just dealing with what has already been promoted and all the people that are already engaging in these practices.
Yeah, thank you. And kind of building on this point and going back to the film, Shannon, I was very interested to see these two sides that you brought out in the film and that we're kind of talking about now. But on the one hand, I got the sense that you found the experiment, that your commitment to mindfulness over the year to be quite transformative. But on the other hand, you also point to some pretty substantial and serious pitfalls, to the point that scene where you're in a hotel room, almost despondent about the project. You're looking at all the research that shows that, we actually don't know as much as we thought we might. So how do we kind of reconcile these two ideas?
I'm still struggling with that, quite frankly, because I'm still meditating every single day. Today is actually day 1001 of my year of living mindfully. And I'm meditating every day because it's actually got to a point now where I recognize, for example, if I'm not meditating for the full 45 minutes that I aim for, if I pare back my training, I actually notice a subjective experiential difference in the clarity of my mind. It's almost as though it's become a lot like daily exercise training, in the sense that it's quite difficult to describe, but in the sense that it's like, if you've been training and then you don't train for a week, you actually, or for 3 weeks or for a month, you actually notice your fitness tapers off, your levels of fitness. It's like there's a real clarity that I notice. Like, if I'm not setting aside deliberate time for solitude and to allow my mind to be free of stimulus, inputs from external sources, if I'm not allowing myself to think the thoughts that need to be thought, so to speak, there's like a clogging effect in my mind. Now, this is all really subjective, so I'm really aware of that, and I've trawled through academic papers to see if there's anything at all that could actually indicate these kind of mind clearing effects that I'm experiencing that are really, really palpable to me. So it's really tricky not to get carried away and sound like an evangelist and oversell it. But at the same time, I'm quite committed to continuing this discussion, because I really do think that mental training, which Patrick describes so eloquently, simply mental training, is a fundamental life skill. Being taught how to understand how our mind works it's just simply a skill in my mind.
Great, thank you. So you say that you're on day 1001. I was wondering this watching the film as well, how do you fit everything in? How do you find the time to do that?
Finding the time is the biggest issue. I use a lot of behavior change strategies to maintain my practice, and if people are interested in following that up, I've written a ton of free blogs and resources on my website, which is shannonharvey.com. So perhaps, if people want to follow up the best strategies, they could go there. But lots of forward planning, let's just say that, and commitment.
Absolutely. It's quite impressive. I'm wondering about the idea of dose. Maybe, Patrick, if we could start with you. What, as a meditation teacher, what kind of dose do you think that we need? How long, how regularly do we have to practice mindfulness to see a beneficial effect?
Not a huge amount of time, but it has to be regular. It's like if it's as simple as if you take up a musical instrument. I want to learn how to play a musical instrument. How much should I practice? Well, it depends. How good do you want to be? If you want to be really good at it, you've got to put a lot of time into it. But if you just want to be able to amuse yourself and get some pleasure out of it, then you don't have to be so tight about it. So it really depends on individual circumstances. Roughly speaking, it takes about 20 minutes usually for the mind to settle. So probably a 20-minute would be a useful working minimum. And then the upper level is entirely up to you and your schedule demands. So traditionally, some traditions have a standard of 30 minutes, some have a standard of 45, some have a standard of an hour. There's no set time. It's just the more time you spend doing it, especially if it's quality time, the better you get. And one of the disadvantages of being too keen at first is you might be sitting there on a cushion waiting for it to end, but not actually doing very much. So basically quality over quantity is another influence. What I recommend to people is basically whatever you can fit into your day to make it sustainable, because it works if it's sustainable. If a person does an intensive meditation retreat, they're full of enthusiasm. My life is going to change. I'll do 2 hours meditation a day. And then after about a week, they realize they're not doing it and they give up because they're not managing it. So it's better just to set yourself a target you can hit and get into a steady rhythm. And it also helps if you're enjoying it. If it actually brings you pleasure doing it. And that tends to feed it.
Yeah, great. And I'm wondering, as a clinical psychologist, we often teach short meditations to our clients, and clients can return to the next session and find a short practice is beneficial. But what is the aim? You're talking about expert meditators. What does that even mean? What does it mean to be a really, really great meditator?
It means, the two sides of the coin as expressed by the Buddha are serenity and insight. So serenity means the ability to calm the mind and the heart, to be completely peaceful and still. So the mind is peaceful and still, the body is peaceful and still. And out of that stillness, there comes quite naturally a happiness, a joy, a lightness, a bliss even. So that's the serenity side. And the insight is, given that stillness, you can then become very sensitive to what it is that the mind is doing. So in traditional terms, you can see yourself create yourself from moment to moment to moment in real time. You can see yourself doing yourself, and that gives you the ability to make different choices and to, as it were, create a different self, more suited to the occasion. But one of the principles that's really important is we talk about training the mind. Serenity is making the mind stronger, but one of the characteristics of the mind is that when it becomes stronger, it also becomes more sensitive. So the more peaceful the mind becomes, the more sensitive it becomes. This opens the door for insight. But of course, if you've got someone with a psychological disturbance, it opens the door for increased disturbance. So this is the two-edged sword. That sensitivity will cause pain for meditators, all meditators. And the Buddha talks about it in terms of the universal characteristic of dukkha, of pain, suffering, unsatisfactoriness, dis-ease. And the tradition points out, if you really pay attention to what's going on, you will hit the perception of that fundamental sense of dis-ease that all humans have. And that can be a shocker. That can be a complete shock for some people. And the mind, the heart needs to be strong, clear and calm to be able to navigate that territory.
Wow, that's quite a sort of provoking answer. And it touches on something that Shannon mentions in the film about our relationship with suffering, how perhaps mindfulness might not eradicate all suffering, but it might change our relationship with suffering. So Shannon, can you tell us a little more about that? I was really intrigued by that idea.
This is actually one of the biggest takeaways for me from the 365 days of meditating is even now, actually, I still don't think that my daily practice makes me any happier, which is surprising given, the titles of the best-selling, mindfulness books. But that's not to say that the quality of my life hasn't improved vastly and that my subjective well-being hasn't improved. But it's because the practice is teaching me how to suffer. And the word that I use in the film that I think explains it best is discomfortable. Comfortable despite the inevitable discomfort that is part and parcel with being a human being in this world. And it just so happens that my suffering is sometimes related to chronic pain or fatigue or emotional disturbances, whatever my suffering is. I don't think that in my life I had ever been really taught how to effectively suffer, like the how of suffering. And it's like, I often think of it, I was raised, in the era of Disney princesses, and, Snow White doesn't bite a poison apple and get a lifelong chronic illness. She gets a kiss from a handsome stranger and lives happily ever after. And so whenever suffering happened in my life, I thought, we mustn't be at the happy ending yet. This is an aberration, or this is not meant to be. Whereas what the practice teaches me is the how of that. And it's interesting that I'm really carrying that through into my parenting now as well, like teaching my kids how to suffer, or trying to anyhow.
Wow, thank you.
I wonder, can I jump in quickly? I find it fascinating. Well, a couple of things. One is Patrick's talking about behavior change and psychology and all these things that sort of, he's answering all the questions that, often would be posed to Shannon and I. And that sort of, to me, is sort of, why I study this is because in the traditions, in the history, and in what the instructors and teachers know, is a lot of the motivations for what this practice can potentially do. And so I think that's fascinating. And it's an excellent reflection of why I think everyone is interested in this idea. I also think that what I observed in the conversation was this really interesting, sort of cycling back to the question that Lydia, you posed to Shannon of how do you rectify the fact that it feels, and it for many people, it is so fundamentally transformative, but the scientific evidence that we have is kind of underwhelming in some ways. And I think that maybe we're not looking in the right place. We haven't worked out how to have partnerships, real, true collaborative partnerships with experts like Patrick and other experts, in Buddhist traditions, meditation teachers, and to help them guide us in how to actually, what should we be looking for? We've quickly thrown monks in MRI machines and said, what do their brains look like? And we ask people whether or not they tick the right or the wrong boxes on our mental health surveys. But in some projects we've designed, we're not really sure. How do you ask people about whether or not they've achieved serenity and insight? It's an incredibly difficult thing to do. And, in the Buddhist context, the answer is in the question, so to speak. But from a scientific perspective, it's really challenging. And I think the only real sort of way out, and the only real way to find out what's the nature of this personal transformation for some individuals, is to have more of conversations exactly like this.
Mm-hmm. Right. And kind of touching on what you're saying, Nicholas, is this a next big question for mindfulness research, or where do you think we have to go next?
I mean, I think there's been a number of efforts to develop exactly the kind of partnerships I'm talking about between academic researchers, meditation teachers, Buddhist experts, scholars. It's been hard though. I mean, the funding organizations aren't always necessarily keen to, buy Patrick's time or find a way to make it worth Patrick's while, or, and many academic institutions don't necessarily see it as a worthwhile contribution for me to sort of, spend time on a meditation retreat. So it's a little bit tricky in that sense. But I think, I think a lot could be gained by doing more of that. I think some of the questions that we've already talked about, I think exploring, for whom is this helpful, for whom is this potentially harmful, with, again, I think the guidance and the insight of meditation experts. And particularly, I think a really fundamental question to me is that question of, when we start to think about different goals, what is sort of the amount? What is it that people need to kick in and plan for? Because at the end of the day, I think, and, you mentioned this, Lydia, sort of as a clinical psychologist, if a client's coming to see you, they want practical advice. They want to know if I'm using this to, as Patrick sort of alleviated, if I'm using this just to feel a little bit better, or maybe I'm using this to sleep better, or maybe I actually want to do the full thing and like I want enlightenment. We need to be able, as clinicians, to be able to say, okay, for the little bit of sort of slightly better mental health, you need to do it 20 minutes a day. You need to at least do it for 8 weeks. To sleep better, maybe 15 minutes when you're sleeping poorly. If you want enlightenment, go talk to someone like Patrick, because I have no idea, right? But we need that sort of cheat sheet and with the guidelines that we can then give people. And we don't have that, And there are actually a number of Buddhist traditions. In Mahasi Sayadaw's writings, there are maps of the practice. And I know a number of researchers and collaborators of mine have talking about, is there a way we can try to translate those, into sort of clinical psychological terms with the input from the experts, the meditation teachers, to try to help us think about these processes a little bit. So I think these are some of the next big steps that we really have to undertake.
And going back to dose, what does the research currently say about dose, Nicholas, from your understanding?
So that's fascinating, because this number of 20 minutes that Patrick threw up, there is some research evidence around that. So Willoughby Britton has found some evidence that, particularly in terms of sleep, that sort of if you're using particular meditation practices to help you sleep, then more than 20 minutes is actually too much, and we tend to see an actual decrease in sort of how much people sleep. Now, we don't know if that's harm or if it's because they're feeling like they need less sleep. But if you're looking for a benefit to sleep, it seems to be less than that. I know other studies, Craig Hassett has talked about, when they've done some analyses, they kind of think that somewhere around 20 minutes might be the magic number. I guess the question at the end of the day is, magic number for what? It's difficult to know exactly how much practice people need to do and of what style in order to get very specific benefits. And that's, we've started a study to try to look at that, and we're hoping to do a lot more in that space of, if you're doing a particular type of practice, exploring a variety of practices, using apps, using, say, courses like MBSR, going to professional retreats, working with a meditation instructor. What are the benefits to mental health, to well-being, and how does that relate specifically to this question of dose? And we need to define dose both in terms of the amount of practice you're doing in any given session, but also things like frequency, which Patrick has alluded to.
And there's also if I could jump in, there's also the issue of the type of meditation. And one of the problems with the mindfulness movement is this word mindfulness has become an umbrella term to cover everything. But in the tradition, it has a very specific meaning. It's got a very specific place. But one of the things that this blanket usage tends to cover over is the fact that there's different types of practices for different types of purposes. So, for example, you might do a pure serenity practice because you just want to be a bit calmer. Now, that's a different relationship to meditation that you have compared to if you're meditating for insight. Very different. And even with something like, I can't sleep at night, I'm going to meditate for a while. For me, it's not so much how many minutes you meditate, but what kind of meditation do I do late at night when I'm about to go to bed at night? Well, firstly, I would ratchet down the effort. So I wouldn't try to be sharp and clear in my awareness, which I would be if I was practicing for insight. I'd be much more mellow and smooth in what I'm doing. I'd be much looser with my relationship to the meditation object. If I didn't normally have breathing and body as my meditation object, I would in that circumstance. And any kind of dullness that would arise in the mind, normally I'd say dullness equals problem, do something else. But here I would say dullness equals good result, let's keep it going. And then the posture starts to droop. And then I think, bingo, I'm ready. Get into bed, I'm awake. So there's, as Shannon was saying, it's a skill. And it can't be captured simply in numbers of minutes.
And Patrick, what are your thoughts about the secularization of the practice? And, you know, mindfulness is just often stripped from Buddhism. What are your thoughts about this as a Buddhist teacher? Is this a problem, do you think?
It's both a problem and not a problem. It's a problem if you think it's a problem. It's a
very Buddhist answer.
Isn't it? We live in a culture in which we got these categories: science, religion, and they're not the same, and they're often at war. If you're going to be scientific, you can't afford to be religious. Buddhism equals religion. Therefore, this is all getting very dodgy, and you've got to be really careful about it. This is culturally a European or a Western battle. It's got nothing to do with the Buddha. The Buddha did not teach religion. He taught Dharma. And Dharma is a cultural category that we don't have in the West. It's an Indian cultural category. In Western terms, if you're looking for where does the Buddha fit, you would go back to the ancient philosophers of Greece, people like Socrates, Plato. He's more a Socrates than he is a Jesus. If you look at his teaching, he does not make what we would call religious commitments in terms of belief structures and so on. In his own time, he had no problem with religion, but he also wasn't interested in it, and he didn't teach it. So fundamentally, and this is one of the reasons why on my bio I say I'm interested in the Buddha's teaching before Buddhism. He taught a way of life. That was what he was interested in. How do I live a flourishing human life? That's his central focus, which is the same as the old Greek philosophers. And if we could fit him into our tradition, understanding him on that basis, I think a lot of these problems about secular versus non-secular would dissolve. The problem with the horror of religion is that it means that a lot of mindfulness, secular mindfulness practitioners and so on, are trying to reinvent the wheel. I mean, the Buddha and these early teachings, there's a huge amount of practical and theoretical understanding. It's a particular form of psychology, particular way of understanding the mind, particular interventions. There's a huge amount to learn from that, but you don't have to be a Buddhist to do that. You can practice Buddhist, quote unquote, meditation for 50 years and not be a Buddhist. It's not a problem. Alternatively, you can be a devout Buddhist and never meditate it before in your life. Most Buddhists do not meditate. So the problem, I think, is this Western determination to create these divisions and then conduct everything in terms of this cultural war and kind of trying to navigate across no man's land in between the two sides. But how that cultural problem can be overcome, I don't know. It's a huge problem.
Great. I wanted to just touch back to the film. I was really quite inspired by at the end of the film when you're working with refugees and marginalised groups. Shannon, I'm wondering if there are any updates. What's happening with the program, and is there any way that people can help?
Yeah, so Amit Bernstein, who is the researcher there in Israel who's doing that extraordinary work, is just about to publish the first paper on that, which is really exciting for him. He's he's just cracking along really, and needs more support. The program needs to get tested now in different situations. So they ran their randomized controlled trial in an urban setting amongst people who have not been given refugee status. They're classed as infiltrators in Israel, and so they're kind of in no man's land. It would be really interesting to see the 9-week program that Amit's developed in different situations. So what does it look like, say, for example, with refugees who have been resettled into new countries? What does it look like with people who might be in big camps like the Zaatari refugee camp that I saw in Jordan? I think ultimately for me, what really inspires me about Amit's work is that there is nothing else like it for refugees. And the idea that I think that there is some really extraordinary efforts being done by large organisations like the UNHCR and not-for-profits and NGOs, and they're doing a really great job where they can, providing food and shelter and education and sometimes social programs and sport programs and things like that. But the mental health of refugees is significantly neglected, and evidence-based mental health is just like unheard of. So I think that's why Amit's research and his program, his 9-week program, is so, for me, it's something that Jules, my husband, who made the film with me, and I are really committed to helping Amit and the work that he has to do. In fact, in COVID-19, the research team there at Haifa just got so motivated because they've delivered the program now within that East African community, and they were all crying out for support. But of course, Amit's program is not funded. So the research team got together and created an online mindfulness SOS program that they're delivering in Hebrew, in English, and in Tigrinya, which is the East African language. So they're a really incredible, motivated group of people, and most importantly for me, they're not backwards about coming forwards and throwing some clinical research behind the program as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Getting towards the end of our time, but Nicholas, I was wanting to ask your thoughts about research. You know, the documentary, as we've discussed, has really uncovered the need for high quality research into mindfulness. And how can members of the public participate or contribute to advancing this field?
Well, I mean, I think as Shannon said, there are a number of researchers who are doing active meditation research. I mean, we've just launched a study, and as part of this release, we'll be providing the link for that. So, if you're an individual who has an active meditation practice and are willing to give us a few minutes a week for 8 weeks, that'll help us learn some things about that relationship between the amount of practice you do, the type of practice you do, and some various aspects of potential benefits and possible harms. And there's all kinds of projects sort of regularly going on, a number of individuals through Mind in Life, people that sort of have active practices. We're all, all of us sort of in the meditation research community are eagerly sort of looking for people that would help us do this work. I think that the big thing often is sort of, as Shannon has alluded to, is sort of funding support and finding ways to actually get people and get researchers, out to the places that we need to be. So allowing us to go and interview expert instructors and understand what they do and to pick their brains and to talk with them about sort of maybe subsidizing some of the work that they do so that we can help to understand what the participants that go on retreats experience, and to actually monitor and measure that and make it worth those people's while to actually allow us to kind of invade their privacy, so to speak, a little bit, because it's a lot to ask of people. They're going on retreats because they want to learn about themselves, not because they want to inform science. People don't necessarily take up meditation or mindfulness practices because they want to advance the scientific understanding of the practices. But I guess the issue sort of is if we can help impose on people occasionally and say, look, we know that what you want out of it is not necessarily to help us, but if we can find a way where helping us helps you and helps what's available to you, I think it'll make the opportunities for people looking to practice in the long run that much better. And I say better, not more bountiful or plentiful because there's too much out there. So my hope would be that in this kind of work, we're able to actually streamline and get people better access to high quality teaching, high quality teachers, and high quality products that guide them in learning things that can actually be helpful for them.
Great, thank you. Are there any other points that anybody would like to add at the end of our discussion? It's been very rich and informative, but any?
Can I throw a question in, because I know that I'm not the MC, but I just really want to know, Patrick, where do you think that this is going to go ultimately? Do you think that the science is playing an important role in popularizing mindfulness now?
I think one of the main, from the point of view of the already existing mindfulness meditation tradition, what the science is all about is essentially marketing. So how do you persuade a secular audience to take up that taking up meditation practice would be a good idea? And this is the way it seems to me that the science is used again and again. It's used as marketing. All these scientists have done all these studies. They say it's a good thing, therefore it's a good thing, therefore you should do it. Now that's great from the meditator's point of view. You're getting customers coming through the door. It feels to me as a non-scientist to be pretty dodgy from the scientist's point of view because you're looking for a result. I mean, surely if you're doing a scientific research into X, you're not looking for a particular result. You just want to find out what is really going on here. So the study, the whole study of mindfulness, from my end of it, it's great. More of it, please. It's fantastic. More customers coming through the door. Of those customers, most of them will drop out. Decades ago, my old Zen teacher, he said that of very few people in proportion to the population ever turn up to learn meditation. Of those who begin, within a year, more than 50% have dropped out. Those who have survived, over the next year, more than 50% will drop out. If someone keeps that going for 2 years, there's a pretty good chance they're in for life. So the fallout rate is massive.
So you're saying my 1,000-day achievement, actually, I'm not quite there yet to being a lifelong meditator.
You're well on the way. You're doing very well.
But Lydia, would you not say that that's similar to the statistics for psychotherapy? I mean, what we know, I mean, in terms of like the number of people who need it, that will turn up for psychotherapy, probably half. I mean, in terms of like, if you were to take into account like availability of actual qualified therapists and things like that, it gets complicated. But I think the statistics are quite similar. The number of people that turn up, it's 60% or so. The number of people that actually go beyond one session, it's probably something like 50%. Most people turn up for one session and never come back again. In terms of the people that actually stick with the practice or stick with the therapeutic process, I mean, the numbers are probably, overall, I would say sort of, even in clinical trials, normal attrition rates, we lose about 30% of people optimistically in the course of a clinical study, in a clinical trial. And that's under really great conditions. So in terms of the people that actually then take those benefits of what they gain in psychotherapy and actually convert them into meaningful change in their life and do not, quote unquote, relapse, again, similar numbers. So I would say the reality is, this is sort of, again, what I find fascinating. I think there's similar processes at work. And I think, in terms of the turnover and the people turning up and the people not committing to it or failing to commit to it or finding it too hard to commit to or not getting what they want out of it, I think are comparable. And that's part of why I think this is such a cool conversation, because I think, this is fundamentally what we need to do. And part of this is which are the people that should be going to the therapist, what type of therapist. And some of those people maybe should be going to see Patrick or, people like Patrick, meditation teachers. And then there's probably people who should be doing both in some combination or in some particular order. So I think that's fascinating. It's really interesting.
You know, I just want to jump in with one more thing, a comment on what Patrick was talking about the idea of the science is kind of like a marketing tool to get people through the mindfulness door. I've just finished writing the book that's going to accompany the film, and I went back to kind of look at the popularization of mindfulness in the West, and really, you know, went back to a time when people like Herbert Benson were kind of writing best-selling books called the Relaxation Response, based on his research where he had snuck transcendental meditators through the back door of his lab at Harvard, and, you know, documented physiological changes when people were practicing TM. And then people like Jon Kabat-Zinn, obviously, who's in the film, and how he named his 8-week program Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction. What's really interesting about that period of time is that it was also straight after Walter B. Cannon had become famous for discovering or coining the term the stress response. And what's even more interesting about his research is that it was funded in a significant amount of his research, I should say, a significant amount was funded by big tobacco. And when you look at that, the idea that we are stressed and we need to buy cigarettes in order to relax, that's a really good marketing technique. So then you have people like Herb Benson and Jon Kabat-Zinn who are coming through this time where stress is something that we need to do something about. So they call these practices that they're very keen to disseminate something that is relaxing. And it's something that I struggled with a lot at the beginning of my year of living mindfully, because my personal practice is, and still is actually, although less so these days, but at the beginning especially, it was anything but relaxing. And it's like, why would anybody want to sit with their uncomfortable thoughts and feelings when there's Netflix like during our downtime? So I think in some ways, and it would be interesting to know what people like John say about this, but I think in some ways it's almost like mindfulness needs a modern day rebranding. It's like this, and it's simply what Patrick and I've, you know, spoken about often, which is simply like mind training. It's simply a skill in the same way that exercise or reading is a skill, and it can be pleasant. But it can also be unpleasant, and it can be relaxing, but it can also be stressful. But it's training.
But how do you?
It's essentially attention training. You're training how to pay attention, and then there's the question of pay attention to what, for what purpose, and all these other questions start to come out. But essentially, meditation is attention training.
I guess it occurs to me, like, how do you, because a number of people have in recent years written fantastic books challenging some of these exact issues that you're hinting at, Shannon. I mean, you know, Ron Purser is writing about some of these complex issues around, so, you know, cultural appropriation and, you know, extracting mindfulness from the Buddhist context. Now, you know, I don't agree with everything that Ron says, but I think he does raise some interesting points. There's a brilliant book by Jamie Kusinkis called The Mindful Elite that basically outlines some of the history of the contemporary mindfulness movement. There's a wonderful paper in the Journal of the American Medical Association in the early 90s about the history of TM and the crash and burn of it and why it crashed and burned. And that's been used, and many people have talked about how that's a model that the current contemporary mindfulness and meditation research community does not want to emulate. You know, if we go down the same path of the opaqueness of the history and the tradition and where this comes from and what we're trying to achieve, that the same exact thing will happen. So I think there's a desire for reform, but I guess at the same time I'm wondering, and you know, I certainly have seen, I've gotten a lot of emails since our paper came out talking about, you know, some of the hype and some of the actual real benefits and some of these issues with it's often incredibly unpleasant, but that doesn't mean it's not working, and maybe that does mean it's working. But I also wonder, and like one of the things that keeps me up and often it keeps me thinking, like, am I doing the right thing, is how do you fight against, how do you compete with the marketing machine? How do you, you know, if we're essentially talking about the equivalent of Philip Morris, you know, so like, how do you, you know, essentially deal, like, as a researcher, as a meditation instructor, as someone who's interested in mindfulness, how do you do good work with the goal of actually trying to genuinely help people when you've got Philip Morris, basically telling you about the problem and then with one hand and offering you the solution with the other? And I'm not saying that you have an answer to it. I'm just saying it's something we all need to think about. I don't know what to do about that.
I guess by making feature documentaries that explore new stories with nuance, that enable people like you, Nicholas, and people like you, Patrick, to have a voice and a platform. I think that the media has a big role to play here, and I think I would say actually my answer to that is if people want to support this kind of storytelling. And if people want to give you guys a voice to support this, then demand more high quality content, and expect that from journalists and expect that from media organisations, and don't waste money on crap, and instead put your money on people who are willing to go deep and tell nuanced stories. Yeah, actually, Nicholas, I'm sitting here in my home office and I have a little post-it note here that I have had there since we first met back in Melbourne. And it says, don't lose the science in the story. Because I was really struggling with a lot of this. How do I tell a story that's really interesting and that people will want to engage with? But how do I also accurately represent what the truth in the science is? And it's something that really underpins everything that I do now. So I'll be forever grateful for you for that advice.
I'm still trying to follow it myself, so.
Okay, well, that's about all we have time for today. What an illuminating conversation. I think this could have been much longer. It's so stimulating to hear the perspectives of documentary maker Shannon Harvey, as well as researcher Nicholas and mindfulness teacher Patrick. And I do hope this is the first of many similar conversations. I hope that we, continue to connect and build these collaborations from different viewpoints on the science and practice of mindfulness. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas.
Thanks.
Thank you, Shannon.
Thank you.